Major breaking news. Attorney General Pam Bondi and her team are kicking butt for the Second Amendment. There's a whole host of things that have just been going on. We have to talk about it when we get right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I should add a former media surrogate for President Donald Trump and a former member of Donald Trump's presidential transition team, in addition to being the top voice of the Second Amendment according to the 2025 Gundies Awards. Thank you for your support and helping make that happen. Okay, huge news today. A lot is going on with the Trump administration touching fingers with the Second Amendment. Of course, the most basic level, protecting our borders, bringing America back to respectability in the world's eyes, meaning we are going to be leading from a position of strength and no longer weakness, and not being bullied and harassed and harangued by a bunch of Europeans and nonsensical countries around this world. All of this, of course, is good for America, our Constitution, and of course, by extension, our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. With that said, so far, the performance of Attorney General Pam Bondi and her team, including, of course, President Trump himself, has been fantastic on our Second Amendment. There's a lot more work to be done, and a lot of work is getting done. But guess what? What we've seen so far should make us extremely happy. I'm just going to go through the quick list. There's so much breaking news here in favor of the Second Amendment. Some of it may get lost in kind of the noise, but I want to hit the highlights so you don't miss any of it. To begin with, Senator Chuck Grassley of the state of Iowa has just announced that he is working very closely with Donald Trump's White House counsel's office to push through 43 new federal judges who will be originalists, support the Constitution, and do the right thing by, for example, the Second Amendment. 43 vacancies remain on the federal bench, and Chuck Grassley is communicating with the White House counsel's office, which is the main group of lawyers within the White House itself under Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, and they are going to start working hard on getting those 43 federal vacancies filled, because every single judge that we can get on the bench that respects our Constitution, respects the right way to interpret the Constitution, which is to understand what it meant in 1791 and apply it, that is good for, among other things, the Second Amendment. As you've seen over and over and over again, if you have judges that respect the Constitution as it is written, we win for, among other things, our First Amendment right to free speech and our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. So big news out of Chuck Grassley, the senator from Ohio who's in charge of the Senate Judiciary Committee, working closely with the White House to fill those 43 vacancies. Great news for the Second Amendment. Number two, we obviously know that the chief of staff for Pam Bondi is Chad Mizell. Chad Mizell is a star, great on the Second Amendment. We know that for a lot of different reasons, not least of which is we've reported on Chad Mizell's various comments, which we'll get to in a minute. But in addition to that, he is married to someone we have talked about quite a bit on this channel. That is Federal District Court Judge Catherine Mizell down there in the Federal District Court system of Florida. A former Clarence Thomas clerk, a former clerk for Judge Greg Katz's on the D.C. Court of Appeals, and William Pryor, the U.S. Court of Appeals judge on the 11th Circuit. He's the chief judge down there in the 11th Circuit, William Pryor, who you probably know. Why? Because I believe he is the only sitting federal appeals court judge in America today who has received an award from the NRA when he was the Solicitor General of Arkansas before being elevated to the federal bench, William Pryor. Catherine Mizell, clerk for all these people, including Clarence Thomas, and most importantly, we've reported on an excellent decision she wrote, a powerful precedent-setting decision she wrote, saying that you cannot ban guns in the post office because there's nothing about the U.S. postal system or the U.S. post office that makes it a quote-unquote sensitive place. Very powerful decision. We reported on here about 8 or 9 months ago by Catherine Mizell, the wife of Chad Mizell, the chief of staff for Pam Bondi in the United States Department of Justice. This is an excellent set of developments. Very smart people there, very competent, very much focused on interpreting the Constitution and the Second Amendment as it's supposed to be, i.e. the way it's written and the history associated with it. Powerful news. Beyond that, we know that Donald Trump has issued that powerful Second Amendment executive order requiring the entire government to look very carefully, in particular the Department of Justice, to make sure there are no laws or regulations that violate the Second Amendment. We know this is going into effect now because all around this great country, in every federal case dealing with the Second Amendment, as I predicted and as you've seen, we are seeing the Department of Justice asking for a pause in the litigation for them to reassess their position in those various cases. And I suspect in a lot of these cases, not just dealing with ATF regulations, pistol brace rules, ghost guns, whatever you want to call these regulations promulgated by President Joe Biden, I think you're going to see a switch in position by the U.S. Department of Justice in a lot of those cases. I'm also looking to see if the Department of Justice will start switching positions in other Second Amendment specific cases, such as, let's say, the Reese case dealing with the law that says 18, 19, and 20-year-olds cannot acquire firearms, specifically handguns, from FFLs, which again was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit down there in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi, by saying that in the Reese case was not allowed. That law was unconstitutional under the Second Amendment in the Reese case. Also going to be very curious to see what the U.S. Department of Justice does in the Range case out of the Third Circuit of New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, dealing with when non-violent felons get their gun rights back, and can you ever take away gun rights permanently or otherwise from non-violent felons such as Brian Range, who had a misdemeanor conviction decades ago in the state of Pennsylvania, and he was disarmed under federal gun control statute 18 U.S.C. 922 G1 for many decades, and the Range case in the Third Circuit said that is not allowed. That violates the Second Amendment for a permanent disarmament if you are convicted of a so-called non-violent, non-dangerous felony. Beyond that, we know that the Department of Justice has made a major shift in how they are viewing the way to allocate resources. They are moving resources away. If you notice this, something that we encouraged on this channel a long time ago, we were one of the first people talking about this distinction between, now we're going to get into Latin for just one brief second here. A critical distinction we've talked about on this channel for a long time between malum prohibitum crimes and malum in se crimes. Malum in se crimes are crimes that are evil in and of themselves. Violent, murder, rape, burglary, robbery. Versus malum prohibitum crimes, which are simply crimes because the politicians say so. The classic example I always give is the length of a gun barrel. If it's too short, it's a felony. If it's not too short, it's fine. This is totally arbitrary. There is no connection to morality or to justice whatsoever in malum prohibitum crimes. They're just made-up crimes, line drawn in the sand by random politicians, and that's all they are. The reason why this is important to understand this distinction is because it is going to start to play a major role moving forward with this Donald Trump, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi Department of Justice. Because in connection with the Eric Adams issue, where the Mayor Eric Adams of the city of New York, the criminal case against him by the so-called Public Integrity Division of the Department of Justice. That's a joke, by the way, but we'll talk about the Public Integrity Division in a separate video. Not a great record. We'll just leave it at that. Terrible record. But with that said, the statement that was made by the Department of Justice in connection with dropping the criminal charges for the moment, without prejudice, by the way, which means you could bring them again down the road if you need to, but dropping the criminal charges against Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. The statement was made by the Department of Justice that specifically said that moving forward, the Department of Justice will laser focus on, ready folks, dangerous, violent, dangerous criminals, and not non-dangerous criminals like Eric Adams. Now, whatever you want to say about Eric Adams, good, bad, or ugly, there is no evidence whatsoever that the former police officer, NYPD, now mayor of New York, Eric Adams, there is no evidence in his background or otherwise that he is a violent, dangerous threat to anyone. And this, of course, is a very important standard and very important development that the U.S. Department of Justice is going to focus on dangerous criminals and devote their resources to dangerous criminals, because that is going to take their attention away from, in my view, the nonsensical malum prohibitum federal gun control laws, of which virtually every federal gun control law, if not all of them, are malum prohibitum laws. The length of a barrel, having a solvent trap on the end of a barrel as a suppressor. All this stuff, these are victimless crimes. These are malum prohibitum crimes. And to have the Department of Justice laser focus on dangerous individuals, gangs, violent thugs, sex traffickers, drug traffickers, this sort of thing, fentanyl sellers and so on. This focus on dangerous criminals is very good because, again, it will take the heat off, and rightly so in my opinion, the enforcement of a lot of these malum prohibitum federal gun control laws. And we know this is already happening in effect with the declaration by the Department of Justice that they are moving and have moved. They are moving and have moved from the ATF, away from the ATF law enforcement agents with the power to arrest and carry a gun. We're not talking about inspectors here or licensing people. We're talking about federal agents with the power to arrest and function as law enforcement agents, away from the ATF's focus on gun-related stuff and focusing them on immigration, where that's a further proof that they're focusing away on malum prohibitum crimes and sending law enforcement resources to where it needs to be devoted, which is to violent criminal thugs, to dangerous people and dangerous criminals, which is what the Department of Justice statement has made. Now let's go beyond that. There's other very good things going on here. Of course, we all know, I heard rumblings about this very early. I didn't want to say anything publicly, but it turned out, of course, to be true that, guess what? Donald Trump and Pam Bondi fired the chief counsel of the ATF. This is extremely good news that this woman was fired. Specifically, this is Pamela Hicks, was fired and escorted from the building. She actually posted on Twitter that she was not only removed from the ATF, not only removed from being the chief counsel or the general counsel of the ATF, she was literally terminated, according to her own post on X, from the federal employee. She was escorted from the office and from her employment with the entire Department of Justice. Again, further proof that these people who, according to most reports on the internet, including by the Gun Owners of America, Pamela Hicks is the chief counsel of the ATF, was largely responsible and heavily involved in a lot of the Biden gun control efforts, and she has gone bye-bye. She is out the door and no longer with the ATF. Again, demonstrating that Donald Trump is now 100% committed to advancing the ball on our constitutional rights, including our right to keep and bear arms, as we're seeing across the board, not just with who they are hiring, but who they are firing and their activity with the executive orders and so on and so on. And last but not least, this is particularly important. I'm going to be a little inside baseball here, but it's going to totally make sense when I explain it to you. That is, there is a letter that was just written by dozens of members of the United States Senate, all Republicans, to the Deputy Director Marvin Richardson of the ATF, specifically asking the ATF to rescind, to get rid of all of the various regulatory rules promulgated against guns during the Joe Biden 4 years. That includes, of course, the engaged in business rule and the loosening it up to try to capture more and more amateur, ordinary sellers of firearms. The pistol brace rule, which of course is nonsensical. The so-called ghost gun rule, which is a re-expansion and expansion of the definition of framer receiver. And of course, the nonsensical zero tolerance policy. But that's all, I think, going to go away. I think all of that will go away very soon, is my guess, by the Trump administration. Now, the reason why it's important, and it touches fingers with the Trump administration, even though this is a letter, listen carefully, even though this is a letter from the senators, it's because there's a very famous story and a very famous lesson that we all understand inside the Beltway, if you will. I actually wrote about this in one of my early books called Disarmed, where I talk about conservative strategies to defeating the liberals in the court system and with legal tactics. One of the stories that I told about in that book, Disarmed, is a story about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the architect of the New Deal, a terrible, sort of, in my view, kind of anti-capitalist, anti-property rights, anti-American, anti-constitution president. I know he's important for World War II generally, but set that issue aside. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when it came to much of American life, was terrible. He really expanded the administrative state, and we are paying the price for the deep state to this day. And hopefully Donald Trump can get all that ripped out and thrown away. But again, we are paying a heavy price for the conduct and views of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president. Now, I bring this up because there's a very important story involving Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and listen carefully to this one. The story goes that he's in the Oval Office. A bunch of progressive groups, and liberal progressive groups, are sitting down with him, talking to him about all these sort of New Deal, economic regulations, expanding the bureaucratic state at the expense of the free market, and so on and so on. And in the context of that meeting, Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned to these progressive movement people, these activists, these lobbyists, whatever you want to call them at the time, and said to them, "I am persuaded, folks. Now go out there in the public and bring pressure upon me." Hear what I just said? Franklin Delano Roosevelt told those people, those activists that he supported and liked, go out there outside the White House and come on back and put pressure upon me and put pressure upon my administration to do what you want me to do. The point being is that often you need other people to make a big whoop-de-doo and to bring pressure upon an administration for the administration to do what they need to do and do something they want to do in the first place. So this letter from the U.S. Senate, the Republican senators to the Trump White House asking them to do this is very good, because it's the sort of pressure that is being brought upon the Trump White House to likely do what they want to do anyway. And the most important part of this letter, and I'll try to put a link to it in the description down below, is to try to destroy the so-called gun registries and the gun owner registries that apparently may have been developed. And I think this is what I'm thinking is going on in that warehouse in West Virginia. The ATF is a very large storage document facility in West Virginia full of hundreds and hundreds of millions of ATF records, including the old 4473 records. And there are stories and rumors and discussions that those records are attempted to be digitalized or create gun registries or gun owner registries. Those need to be destroyed. Those, I believe, violate federal law 6 ways to Sunday. Someone needs to do an audit of Fort Knox for the gold. Yes. We need to do an audit of Ukraine spending. Yes. We need to do all the Doge auditing. Yes. But we also need to do a major audit. We need to send the Doge team to that warehouse controlled by the ATF in West Virginia to look for any evidence of electronic databases, electronic registries, electronic list of gun owners, or electronic list of privately owned guns, whatever may be there. That, I believe, runs afoul of federal law, and those would need to be destroyed. And that is exactly what this letter from the Senate to the Trump administration to the ATF under Trump is specifically asking. They're saying, we promptly want you to immediately destroy the hundreds of millions of ATF Form 4473 firearm transaction records and other licensee records that are over 20 years old. It goes on to say there is no value to law enforcement, and they contain sensitive information about millions of law-abiding owners. And again, I would also add that I think these, if there's lists, they're not allowed to be out there. There's a lot of evidence and a lot of laws out there. We don't need to get into the details, but those should be destroyed to the extent anyone is compiling a list of gun owners and guns in that warehouse by the ATF or anywhere else the ATF or the federal government is doing it. Someone needs to laser focus on that, and that is something Doge should be doing. And I think this letter from the United States senators to the Trump White House is a sign that people will be focused on that effort, and I think they should. All right, folks, so there you have it today. Thank you for watching. Make sure you follow me on X at For a Box of Diner. Don't forget to subscribe to YouTube and Rumble. We're closing in on 200,000 subscribers on YouTube. We're trying hard to get there, so help us get there. And again, thank you again for your support, and I look forward to talking to you again here at the For Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.